Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I recently saw a list of top game books for people to read to help them improve your chess game, and I was very disappointed that my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book, was not on the list. It's certainly one of my best books, and I've already done a video about it, but it made me think maybe I should do another video about it, because I really do think it's very helpful. As I spent a lot of time in the introduction explaining, of course you want to read a million game books. It's something I did. It was extremely helpful. But when you're reading most of these game books, they're almost all games by professional players. And it shows you what your game should look like and what you should be doing. And the mistakes they make are usually fairly subtle, although very instructive. But the amateurs make mistakes all the time. And not only that, their opponents don't take advantage of them. So we have a double benefit. We can see the mistake, and then we can see what they could do about it and what they don't do and why that was not right. And this is extremely helpful if you're an amateur player. Another objection I get is, I don't want to read a book about people putting their pieces on prees, and they confuse the word amateur with the word beginner. In chess, amateur means you're below master level, means you're below 2200. So there's actually games in my book where people are up around level 2000. Most of them are not. But the point is, these are not a bunch of beginner moves where people are putting pieces on pre. I do have a couple games like that at the back of my book, Every 1 Second Chess Book, to explain to beginners what's going on. But I don't do that in the World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book. All right, so last time I picked out a game from the chapter Too Slow, and this time I thought I'd pick a game from the chapter Endgame Mishaps. So let's take a look at this game, and I'm going to go relatively quickly until we get to the endgame, because that's the emphasis on the game, even though there's a lot of instructive play before that. And I'd also like to point out that I can't do justice in a video to everything that's going on in the game book, because I can put so many more words than I can in a 25-minute video inside the book. So you're only getting kind of the overview of what's going on in the book. The book is, in a sense, much more instructive than watching the game on video. All right, so let's go through this amateur game. It was played at a 45-minute time limit with 45-second increment, the very common 45-45. I do have the time stamping in the book. Of course, I don't have the time stamping in the video. So this is not one of those games where the time stamping was the most important part of the game. That I put in my chapters Too Fast and Too Slow, but it's still important. Okay, so d4, knight f6, c4, g6. This could be either a King's Indian or a Grunfeld, depending on whether black's next move is going to be bishop g7 or d5. Knight c3, allowing the Grunfeld with d5. You could play an anti-Grunfeld with a move like f3. Black says, no thank you, I'll just play a King's Indian. White plays knight f3. The most common move there is to play e4. Knight f3 usually transposes into e4 moves. If white does play soon after e4, white could also play the fianchetto lines with knight f3 and g3, or g3 right away. All right, so knight f3, d6. And now white plays a move that you almost never see at the master level. Bishop to f4. In fact, if we look over here, we can see bishop f4 was played in the Lichess player base. Let's look in the master database. Oh, that is the master database. So bishop f4 was played, but it's only played about, if we could do a little math here, we've got 6,000, 7,000, over 7,000 games. It was played 244 times. So it looks like about 3% of the time. So it's not a very common move. It's not a terrible move. The problem with that move is that black at some point in time is going to be able to force e5, and that's going to make the bishop move again. But it's not going to be trivially easy for black to do that. So, bishop f4, while not the best move, is certainly a playable move. All right, so in this position, black castles. Black's setup here is called the King's Indian setup, and if it's played against d4 and c4, it is the King's Indian itself. If it's played against some other moves, like let's say a London or something where white doesn't have a pawn on c4, if we put that white pawn on c4 back on c2, then it would be a King's Indian setup against the London. All right, so white plays g3. Usually you don't play g3 and bishop f4 because it kind of blocks the bishop on f4 from his retreat squares. But again, the bishop's probably not going to retreat to g3 anyway. Black plays knight bd7, getting ready to play that e5 move. Sometimes he puts the other knight on d7. Sometimes he puts the knight on c6 and doesn't worry about d5. Here, white should kind of ignore him and play bishop to g2. White plays queen to c2. And now it says you're out of the database. The database said, if we go back a couple moves, that white here would usually play e3, h3, queen d2, but g3 took him out of the game book. Rook e8, consistent with the idea of trying to force that pawn up to e5. White plays d5. Well, now black can play e5 and white can take en passant, but black can just take back with f takes e6 and then play the pawn up to e5 anyway. Black, whoops, didn't want to hit that button. That's what happens when you hold onto the buttons. Black plays c6, breaking on the c file instead. Not a ridiculous idea. He could open the c file and white has his queen there, and then he could develop a rook to the c file and pin that knight to the queen. White plays e4. Black takes. White takes the correct way with the c pawn, keeping his two center pawns. If he plays the other way, let's turn on the engine for a second. If he takes the other way, e takes, then knight to c5 is very annoying. Black is threatening moves like bishop to f5 and controlling the center. And the engine says black's actually already completely winning. For instance, if white plays bishop to e2, bishop to f5, and then if he plays, let's say, queen d2, the knight goes to e4, knight takes, knight takes. Let's say the queen goes to, I don't know, c1 to try to guard things. Queen to b6, double attacking f2 and b2, and you get the idea. All right, so back to the game. So c takes d5, that was the right move by white. We'll turn off the engine. Black plays knight h5. That's not the most accurate here. Again, he could look at more moves like knight to c5, hitting the e-pawn even though it's already guarded. But knight h5, the bishop really had to move from f4 anyway, and the knight on h5 isn't better, and it's not one of those positions where black's trying to play his break move f5. The center isn't locked, it's just the d-pawns are locked, but the e-pawns are not. So bishop to g5, black says go away with h6, bishop e3, and again, we've got ideas for black to get the knights out of the way and get them into better shape. Black plays knight to e5. All right, in the book, what do I say about knight e5? Knight e5, I say this is a common minor tactical oversight often made by lower intermediates. The bishop on g7 is overworked by its need to guard h6 and the desire to guard e5. Better is to retrieve the wayward knight on the h file by playing knight on h to f6 equal, but it's always difficult to admit a mistake. And now white should play knight takes e5. And the problem with black's position is this bishop is overworked. If he takes with the bishop to keep his pawns clean, he loses his h-pawn. And if he takes with the pawn, it's not so much that he gets double pawns, it's that this pawn is now blocking this bishop, and it makes that bishop much weaker. So that's what white should have done. Played knight takes e5. All right, so knight e5, not a good move for white. White also makes a minor mistake by playing knight d4 and not taking the knight. Black now develops the bishop to g4 and hits that weak f3 square. White could have played bishop g2 a couple times here and just gotten ready to castle, but he's been fooling around a little bit. He decides he better neutralize that diagonal with bishop e2. Black trades off. White decides to take with the queen. And now black should get his pieces in the game. Maybe rook to c8. I guess he was worried that, this a-pawn is hanging, but if white ever moves the knight after rook to c8, then black can just play a6, but there's no need to play it right away. There's no piece that's threatening to go to b5. So a6, again, a little bit of inaccuracy, and white plays f4. All right, well, how many safe moves does black have here? He can't play knight c4, he can't play knight d3, he can't play knight f3, he can't play knight g4, he can't play knight g6, he can't play knight f7, he can't play knight c6. He has to play knight d7. Does he have any counterattacks on white pieces where he doesn't have to move the knight? No. So he could make this move in about 20 seconds. Anything over that, he's wasting a little time. And he did take 33 seconds. That's a little bit long to figure this out, but sometimes with amateur players, they don't have the board vision to see that's their only safe move. But if you can figure that out in less time, that's good, as long as you realize you're not missing any tactics, which in this case you're not, and sometimes that takes a little time. So knight d7. And now in the book I say, what should white's best plan be here? And I show a diagram, and I'm asking my readers to figure out, if you were white here, what would you do? And the answer in the book, I'll read it verbatim here, is, this is not an easy decision. There's no answer that stands out above the rest, but that's quite normal. Positions don't always play themselves out according to clear long-term plans, and searching for one that doesn't exist is not going to be productive. Well, you could search for one that doesn't exist, and you might not know it doesn't exist, but if you keep insisting on doing it and thinking there must be one there, that's what's not as productive. Then they would say, let's consider the engine's top two lines. The engine suggests white could play f5, and the engine suggests white could castle. Now we have a newer engine, stronger than when the book was written. Let's see what his top lines are. He says that he agrees that those are the top two moves, f5 and castle. And he's thinking white has maybe a slightly more than a one-pawn advantage if white does that, and that's a pretty big advantage. A normal opening advantage would be about 0.2, 0.3, maybe a little higher in the King's Indian. But here it's around 1.0, which is pretty good. Now he's saying castle at 1.0. All right, let's turn off the engine and keep going with the game. So white plays g4, black plays knight f6, white plays f5. Now white's still leaving his king in the center, a little bit dangerous. Knight c5 hits the e-pawn. F takes g6, f takes g6. And now white plays a move which doesn't look very good. Knight e6. Yes, that's a great place for the knight, but the black knight can just take him right away and double the pawns. Now it's true that pawn on e6 breaks black's position in half, but that's only good for white if white can break into the king's side and checkmate the king while the black pieces are trying to get over there. I don't think that's really true here. Knight takes e6, pawn takes e6, queen a5. Already with the idea of maybe getting to the middle of the board and going after those weak isolated white pawns. White plays bishop d2 to stop the threat of knight takes e4. Black says, how are you going to guard your e-pawn? White says, I'm going to play h4, an interesting decision. Let's turn on the engine again. Engine says, white's completely losing, but h4 is very reasonable. It's fighting for the best move with rook g1 and queen g2. So even though you might think, well, white's not really going to get anywhere, he doesn't really have any great moves anyway. And now black has to decide, how does he want to play this? He could double attack the g-pawn. Let's move the video back up. He could double attack the g-pawn with queen g3 check and then win the g-pawn, or he could just take the e-pawn right away. He decides to check, and the engine says, sure, that should win, minus 2.5. We'll turn the engine back off. And king to d1. And he says, let me win that pawn, and I'll take aim on your doubled isolated pawns later. That's usually a good idea. Win the better pawns first, and leave the weaker pawns on the board so that you can get them. White trades off, bishop takes, knight takes, and then plays king to e2. Okay, so let's see what it says in the book. It says, after knight takes g4, it says, black's wasting time to play that move because he took so much time. He had to recapture the queen over here. It's black's move here. How much time should you take to recapture the queen? Well, unless you have a check somewhere, knight takes g4 is the only move. Black took 64 seconds to make that move. Well, that's how you lose games, is you need to save your time for critical decisions. Well, it's extremely critical that you take the queen here, but it's also extremely trivial. So, you know, taking more than 10 seconds for this move is silly, especially since it's an online game where don't even have to write down your moves on your score sheet. So that was definitely a time management mistake. In the book I say, once you have determined the best move and are absolutely sure, just play it. Taking additional time to see what might happen next move is just a waste of time. All right, so there's a lot of time management information in the book because time management is such an important part of chess. All right, so knight takes g4 was the move. King e2, and now that bishop on g7 is pretty good, and black decides to trade it off. Bishop takes c3. Whoops, I said go forward, not jump back, guys. All right, king e2, bishop takes c3. You have to be careful about which arrows you hit on the keyboard to get to the next move. All right, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3. We're starting to get to the interesting point of the game. Now, black should be winning. Black is up an entire pawn with a better pawn structure, but there's still a lot of work left to be done. Black guards the knight. That's an outpost knight. An outpost piece is one on a weak square on the opponent's side of the board that's guarded by a pawn. And that knight cannot be captured by the bishop. It's the wrong color, which makes it even stronger. The problem is it's the endgame, and having outpost pieces in the endgame is less helpful than having outpost pieces in the opening and middle game because you need targets, and right now that knight on g4 really doesn't have a lot of targets. So white says, let me go after the king side. Black says, let me neutralize it. I'm winning. Let's trade rooks on the open file. White says, I won't trade. Black says, good, as long as you don't stop me from trading. Ditto here, rook f8. White realizes he's between a rock and a hard place. If he moves the rook away, black can play a move like rook f2 check. But trading just goes into this endgame down a pawn, which should be losing. So rook takes, king f3. And now black has to figure out what to do, how to make progress. And now black plays a very interesting move. He plays knight e5 check, and he says to white, how would you like to go into a king and pawn endgame where you're down a pawn? Well, you know, if you're one of these people that plays by hand waving and you're white here and you say, oh, I'll just take the knight because, you know, that's a strong knight in the middle of the board and it saves me from having to move out of check. Well, that would be very short-sighted because black can just play king g7, king f6, and king takes e6, and there's nothing white can do because after bishop takes d takes, he can't play king f4, he can't play king g4, he can't get in, and then black would be up 2 pawns, and then he would come over and move his g-pawn and eventually win the game quite easily. So instead, white plays the right idea. He plays king f4, threatening to win the pawn. And now black thinks for a long time, and he should, because he has to decide, do I want to save the knight or do I want to sacrifice the pawn? Which one is right? Let me read you what it says in the book. I wrote, black took 5 minutes to play the move that he plays here, which is king to g7, which I give an exclamation point or two. He's sacrificing his precious extra pawn. In this situation, black can use the extremely strong principle, it's not what you trade that matters, but what's left on the board after you trade. And what's left is calculable as a win. However, a chat with black afterwards revealed that he didn't carefully calculate to see if this worked, but rather he did it on general analysis, sort of hand-waving, figuring his kingside majority would outweigh white's better king and doubled isolated e-pawns. His judgment was good, but as we shall see, his ability to understand exactly why and to execute were not so good. In the interest of truth in advertising, the engine said that black could also get the same result by playing king g8 as king g7. All right, so white says, well, if black moves his king up to f6 and then plays king takes e6, he's not only winning a pawn, but he's also guarding the knight again. So I have no choice here. I have to take the knight and then take the pawn and hope that I can save the endgame, because if I don't, it's going to be even worse. So here you could pretty much make your move by the move domination idea, which is if you can figure out that one move has to be better than all the other moves, then you may as well play it even if you're not sure how good that move is. So here, white may as well win the pawn in the hope that black is not winning the game or misplays it, because if he doesn't, after king f6 and then king takes e6, it's going to be rather hopeless. So white understandably takes the knight. Let's see how much time he took to do that. He took quite a bit of time. He only had 4 minutes left, and he took almost half his time. It says that, you know, you really don't want to trade. In the book I say you really don't want to trade into the king and pawn endgame if you think you're going to be losing. But on the other hand, it's going to be really bad otherwise. And of course, it's always tough to make a decision like that where you think you're going into a line that might be losing, but you have to try for the line that gives you the best hope you can. So we can't really fault white for doing that, even though maybe this endgame is theoretically winning for black. All right, so pawn takes, king takes, and now what's the right move for black here? And it turns out that this is not an easy move at all, and these are the kind of moves that good players would play. Let's read what I wrote in the book. I wrote in the book, black plays g5, which is not the best move. And I say, one of the keys to this position is that the pawns on the queen side are perfectly symmetric. That means neither side can gain a tempo if the other side just matches the moves. For example, at some point, if black plays a7 to a5, then white can play a2 to a4. And if black then plays b7 to b6, white can play b2 to b3, and it's still going to be black's move. So the queenside pawns cannot be used to gain or lose a tempo unless someone makes a mistake. However, it is also important to understand that just because you can't use the queenside pawns to win or lose a tempo, that doesn't mean that it might not be critical to use those pawns for other means, such as to fix or not fix the pawns for later targets of king forays. The fact that you can't gain a tempo and that the pawn location might be important both come into play in some lines. We will deal with what happens after g5 in the game continuation. However, it turns out that this is not even a good move, much less the best one. It's very instructive to see what black should have done instead, since the general ideas can occur in other king and pawn endgames. Let's start with another idea of getting the pawn rolling. Let's look at king h6 first. The idea is to support g5. Now it says white cannot afford to keep his king to the queen side to race in any of the lines where black keeps his 2-on-1 king majority. For instance, if now king d5, g5, and black just wins. Therefore, white has to try king f4 to stop black from playing g5 check safely. And now black can play g5 check. And after pawn takes, king g6. And now white's in Zugzwang. He can't make any king moves without losing the g-pawn and giving black that passed h-pawn that will win the game. And now white cannot lose tempos here. For instance, if white plays d5 here, then let's see, black can play, let's see if I have my right analysis here. Black can play b5. If white now plays b4, black can play h4, king g4, h3, king h3, king here, and he's going to win both the pawns. And there's nothing you can really do to stop that. However, after pawn takes, king g6, white could try to move the queenside pawns, but he's going to lose sort of in a similar manner. So king h6 would be superior and win, but actually you can win a tempo. Even better is to play king h7 and make white play here and use a tempo, and then play here. And now when white plays here, and you play here, and he takes, and you play here, then it's white's move. And when he moves here, you move here. When he moves here, you move here. And now he's running out of moves, and then when he moves away from the pawn, you take it. And now this pawn will deflect the king. You'll come over and win these pawns, just like before, but even easier. So it turns out that king h6 wins, king h7 wins even better, and g5 doesn't. All right, so let's go back to the game. Black plays g5, throwing away the win. White, of course, has to take it. Black says, go get my pawn. White says, sure, no problem. What black pushes, white goes after it. And now black realizes if he keeps pushing the pawn, he's not going to win tempos. He's just wasting time that he could use to get these pawns. So he comes up to go after the pawns. Black take, white takes, black takes. Black goes after the e-pawn, and now we have an equal position. Should be a draw. White pushes, black goes there, and now black's threatening to play e6 and keep the white king away from the pawn, put him in Zugzwang. So white only has one move to save the game, and he plays it, king f5. And now all the players can do is push the queenside pawns, because if black ever pushes the pawn here and plays this move, he loses to king e6, and we've got trebuchet. because both sides are going to take the same number of tempos on the queenside pawns, and eventually black will be in Zugzwang then, and will have to move away from his e-pawn and lose. So e6 is a losing move there. In the game, black plays e6. So that was completely the wrong idea. The right idea would be to push the pawns. Let's say a4, a5, a4, b6, b4, and now just play king to d4. If white plays pawn up, you bring your king back, and now white's the one that's losing, or at least he's the one in Zugzwang. I think he's losing. And if white plays king to e6, then you play king to e4, and if he takes your pawn, you take his pawn, and it turns out that white can still hold the draw there, or actually both sides can hold the draw. All right, so that was the right idea in the endgame. Instead, as we said, black plays check, and let's see how much time he took on that move. Black had more time than white. White was the one who was in time trouble. So in this position, black played e6. He had 13-13, 13-22. So he used only 36 seconds to lose the game with e6 check. And white, of course, plays king f6. White now has about 6 minutes left. He's gained a little time on the clock since he has a 45-second increment. Now all white needs to do to win the game is to copy black's moves on the queen side. So black plays a5. White should play something like a4, but he could also play b3. Instead, he plays, let's see, how much time did he take on this move? White took enough time on this move. He took almost about 3 minutes, and he can't take too much longer. He only had 6 minutes on the clock. He has the 45-second increment. But he plays the unbelievable move, b4, which goes from completely winning to completely losing. Look at that bar drop like a rock. Now black can't believe his good fortune. Now all black has to do is run white out of moves. And he could do that in several ways. He could play pawn takes, b5, that would win. He can play a4 like he did in the game, and when white pushes, he could push too, and now again it's white's move. White's in Zugzwang. He has to move away in this trebuchet kind of position in the middle of the board. He moves the king. Black takes the pawn. White says, let me go after the b pawn. Black says, let me get out of the way of my pawn. White says, would you like the race? I'll take your b pawn. Black says, no, you can't catch my pawn anyway. I'll just guard my pawn. And White says, gee, I was hoping you wouldn't do that. Now it's hopeless and I resign. Okay, so we saw a few going back and forth in that endgame. Let's go back and show you how it went back and forth. Let's go back to where it was king takes e5. So here black's winning if he plays king h7 or king h6. He plays there and he's no longer winning. Now it's equal. Equal. Losing. Now black's losing. Black goes there. White has winning moves like b3 or a4. And that move loses. So now it went completely the other way. You know, you need to take your time and figure these things out if you have the time. Very, very important. You got to count the tempos. a4, winning, b5, b6. Once those pawns run out of moves, the question is, whose move is it going to be? It's going to be white's move. And black very cleverly makes sure he cannot get into a race with king c5. And white properly resigns. All right, if you haven't bought the book yet, which is the world's most instructive amateur game book, I highly recommend it. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, great. Best thing you can do for the channel is tell your friends about it. And if you'd like to like the video as well, great. Subscribe, wonderful. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.